Greetings, and welcome back to DEFKON. I'm Android with Loud and Clear, and we are picking right back up with the contract from last week, the VTOL multi-role contract. So without further ado, let's get right into the first craft. Our first aircraft of the day is the NKX-2 Minkin, sent in by Thine Spree. This is a pretty cool looking aircraft. I like the top wing design, always a fan of that. Keeps the weapons kind of more centered on center of mass. It raises your center of lift. It's just generally a good idea, I think. It's got a really cool looking tail as well, with those surfaces at the back doing pitch and yaw. I like that. And performance wise, it is exceptionally fast, especially compared to the other craft that we're going to see today. Very fast for a VTOL craft. It can definitely well exceed Mach 1 at sea level. And it is also very stable in VTOL mode as well. It does need its jet thrusters in order to lift off. The VTOL engines by themselves do not produce enough thrust with this ordnance, with full ordnance, to lift it off the ground. But with the jets, you can very easily lift it off the ground, so I'm willing to overlook that. And yeah, it's overall a very good looking, very high performance aircraft, so let's see how it did in the mock-up. I would say that was a very good performance in that fight. It was very quick at taking out the enemy fighters with basically no risk to itself, staying at long range, taking them down with the radar missiles very effectively, and then charging in and just destroying the ground targets. Not necessarily efficiently, but quickly, and it's a good idea to expend all your ordnance anyways before you come back to base, so that's just fine. And in the meantime, let's see if the next aircraft can put up a better performance. Next up, we have the LKX-2N3 Kestrel sent in by Mechameme. This is another cool-looking aircraft. It's got the big S Delta wings, which I wasn't expecting to see on planes of this size, but hey, they work. They actually do flow really well. It's got those kind of wing strake-ish things coming out of the cockpit leading into them. I think it flows really well. And then you've got the engines coming out from those tail booms. And I love how this thing looks. Like, the Minkin looked good. This thing looks really good. And it's got actually pretty much the same tail design, coincidentally, except it's got a lower fin. And having that bottom fin on the bottom of the tail doing your yaw is going to help with your roll stability, because you've got surfaces yawing above and below the center of mass. So that's going to help out with it not rolling too much when you yaw. But there's also a risk of a tail strike, so, you know, positives and negatives. I do just think it looks really good. It has a considerable amount of air brakes, as I'm sure you noticed. But yeah, overall it just looks kind of nice, and it, you know, takes off, you know, perfectly stably with VTOL. Nothing, it's not super great, there's nothing noticeably bad about it, it's just really good. So, let's see how it does in combat. And that was a, decent enough combat performance from the Kestrel. Less effective than the Minkin, I would have to say, personally. But, it got the job done. No casualties. So, it was just, I guess, a little bit slower. And a little bit less efficient. So, well, it does still look very good. Because it objectively did not perform as well as the Minkin, but it looks very good. And I'll have to take that into account. But we do still have one more aircraft left to check out. The last craft we will be looking at today is the FF-235B Sea Panther sent in by Stardust. This is an F-35. There's nothing else really. It's an F-35. Admittedly, it's a very, very cool looking take on the F-35. It's got that Saturn engine at the back as its main engine, which does rotate down using DLC parts, which I can't really count for him. It's really cool, but it's a DLC part, so I can't really count that as cool points because not everybody has access to them. It's just an extra tool. So, well done, but I can't really take that into account when deciding if this is cooler or a better engineering feat than the other aircraft, because not everybody has those hinges. But I will say that it's very cool. And this one, compared to the other two, is relatively light, and it's pretty decently maneuverable as a result. However, because it only has the one Saturn, and still carries a somewhat decent amount of ordnance, it is not fast. It really is not fast at all. It cannot do Mach 1 on the deck. It can do it at altitude, but not quite at lower altitudes, not at sea level, certainly. But it is fast enough, so we'll just see how it does. A good combat performance out of the Sea Panther, I would say. It did well. It did well enough, certainly. Not as well as maybe the other two. I don't know. You could compare it to the Kestrel. It looked very good doing it, to be fair. But yeah, so it did pretty good. The VTOL is not the most stable as a result of it relying a lot on the main engine and the lifter fan, much like the F-35 does. And so as a result, it's not that stable. It's not the easiest to control. So it does lose points for that. And yeah, after all of that, I would say that I am definitely ready to determine a winner. One of these aircraft I wouldn't say vastly, one of these aircraft noticeably outperformed the rest. And it did look good while doing it. Even though I would say all three of them look fantastic. All three of them did the job. But one of them really shined as the best combination of good looking and effective. With the Minkin replacing the F-17 Wasp as Blue Force's premier carrier multi-role aircraft and as its so far only VTOL aircraft, that concludes contract number 2. And with the conclusion of contract number 2 comes contract number 3. Blue 4 has noticed that its air superiority aircraft, which is based off of the F-15 Eagle, is somewhat lacking in the face of these new 4th gen fighters from OPT-4. It still holds the advantage at long range, but its maneuverability is definitely inferior to that of OPT-4's fighter. So, Blue 4 is calling for a new air superiority fighter. This contract is relatively simple. It will just be a design for a fighter. Regular Air Force fighter. The only interesting stipulation, essentially, is that it does need to, again, as with previous designs, it needs to have a decent amount of fuel to be able to travel around, escort bombers, that kind of thing. So, you'll definitely be familiar with these fuel requirements. And besides that, just make something that fights well. We're definitely going to be running fights with less missiles to see how these aircraft actually perform when they're not relying on those weapons, because that's really what's important here. How your craft fights with 27 radar missiles and 15 heat seekers doesn't really have any major bearing on the design. It's definitely a factor, but what's more important is how well it maneuvers. That's where the difference in these aircraft is going to lie, is how much fuel can it hold and how well can it maneuver. So that's what we'll be testing. All the details will be on the Discord. And that's pretty much it. So...
finding all non-existent. Yeah, and the rest you went.